Hey everybody, it's Rapid. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the lineups for the War Thunder Summer Cup and evaluating which ones are potentially the strongest. And rejoice, fellow War Thunder esports enjoyers, because this time around we actually don't have top tier. We have a lot of mid-tier vehicles, which makes this a lot more interesting than it has been traditionally, and does mean we should see at least a somewhat different meta across a lot of these events. Now, as a brief side note, all these events should have Twitch drops enabled. You can easily link your Twitch account to your War Thunder account, and I will have the dates listed so that you can tune in if you so choose and if these events haven't already gone off. Also, this whole event is sponsored by somebody, but they're not paying me, so I'm not mentioning them. Now, for our first part, I am going to go a little out of order and look at the plane section first, because I don't really focus that much on planes on this channel, and I don't have that much of an informed view as to which of these are the best in a 1v1 dogfight. The Planes event does take place from August 2nd to the 3rd, and the immediate standout here for me, admittedly as more of a novice, are the F5Es, which seem to be some of the strongest dogfighters here. The MiG-27M is potentially pretty interesting, and I do think that Kfir C2 has a very real chance of seeing play. Those are currently my picks, although I could very much be wrong, as again, this is not really my specialty. Going into the events that I know a little bit more about, we're first going to be looking at the 4v4 ground only event that's going to take place from July 26th to the 27th. And the very first lineup we see is USA with the XM803, M60A3 TTDS, M60A1 Rise P, and the M60A01 AOS. The immediate thing that stands out to me this lineup is the XM803. The XM803 actually has quite good mobility, especially given a lot of the other vehicles you're going to see in this event. Also, it does have the roof-mounted RWS 50 cal, which can be used to knock out things like tracks, especially over obstacles. The reload on the gun isn't terrible, isn't great. The real thing holding this tank back is probably going to be the Dart, because the Dart is not exactly good. It's been nerfed a few times, so it is pretty underwhelming. The problem with the 803 is that while I feel in the hands of a good player, the 803's somewhat trolly armor and excellent mobility can make for a very potent combo, the M60s are not really anything special. Don't get me wrong, they're not awful, they're probably not going to hold the lineup back, but they're probably not really what you want, given that their mobility is pretty lackluster, they don't really have a ton of armor, and they have high silhouettes. For Germany, we have the Leopard 1A5, the M48 Super, the Leopard 1, and the M48 A2 GA2. Now, right away I do see a bit of an immediate issue, and that is your last two tanks, the Leopard 1 and the M48 A2 GA2, do not have stabilizers. In this kind of event where you are playing fairly good players, and they're probably going to know where you are most if not all of the time, not having a stabilizer is a pretty big downside. So even though the M48 A2 GA2 does have a pretty effective shell and isn't bad in most other areas, I do think it's going to struggle to really be relevant, and you're mostly going to be leaning on the Leopard 1A5 and M48 Super. That being said, you do at least have two tanks that have stabilizers and darts, so it does give you something to work with, although I wouldn't say the mobility on either of them is that exceptional. The Leopard 1A5 is pretty mobile, but I still think the XM803 would largely beat it out. The real problem is that the Leopard 1A5 and the M48 Super are very much just click on the middle of them and they die 9 times out of 10, and that's going to be the biggest issue with this lineup. Your two starters don't really have a ton of durability, you only really have one that has great mobility, and your last two backups, if you do come down to the third vehicle, are pretty poor. So it doesn't really seem like that great of a lineup to me personally. For the Soviets, we get the T-64A 1971, the T-62 M1, the Object 435, and the T-55 AMD-1. Overall, this is a pretty solid rounding of tanks because all of them have stabilizers and all of them have darts. But this does have basically all of the standard Soviet drawbacks on essentially all these vehicles. They are the most Russian tanks you could possibly imagine. Generally poor gun depression, poor traverse speeds, poor elevation speeds, and of course the ever-present terrible reverse gear. The vehicles do have some pretty respectable armor all around. The T-64A probably has some of the stronger armor, although the T-62 M1 and T-55 AMD-1 can be pretty trolly, as can the Object 435. So on the whole, it is a pretty robust brawling lineup, and that's really the primary reason why you would take a lineup like this. Onto the UK lineup, we have the Oliphant Mark II, the Chieftain Mark X, the Chieftain Mark V, and the Chieftain Mark III. This does give you a decent number of tanks that actually have pretty good hull armor and pretty good guns for their battle rating. So in general, if you are looking for a tank to anchor your team by holding a defensive strong point, this is actually a pretty decent lineup for it, and the Oliphant's not bad in general. I really do feel like this Chieftain Mark X might be the right pick, even though the mobility on the Chieftains is pretty substandard, but the mobility on a lot lot of the vehicles in this overall competition isn't really the best, at least for the 4v4 ground. So in general, I do feel like if you have a defensive position, especially one that has a nice hill that you can hide the hull of a lot of these vehicles behind, this does become a pretty solid all-around lineup. For Japan, we have the Type 74F, the Type 74E, the Type 74C, and the STB2. Now, the Type 74s do have pretty decent mobility, in addition to the fact that their turrets can actually be quite trolly at times, so especially if they're just peeking over hills, they can sometimes eat shells, and their internal layout is actually not bad either for, again, just kind of eating poorly placed shells. I don't think the Type 74s are great in terms of the protection aspect, but they're not as weak as they might appear on paper. On top of that, all of the Type 74s have stabilizers. Even though the C is stuck with a lower quality APDS round, it's still generally going to be enough for the vast majority of situations, especially in the hands of a skilled player. So this seems like this could be a nice sleeper hit, well-rounded lineup. It doesn't excel in any one area, but it doesn't have any major drawbacks that keeps it from working either. And on top of that, it also doesn't have any major dips in quality from version to version. You have 3 Type 74s that have broadly pretty similar performance, even though the biggest performance dip you will see is going from the Type 74E to the C, because then you drop an APFSDS round all the way down to an APDS round, but that APDS round is still pretty solid, so it isn't that much of a drop. For Italy, we have the Leopard 1A5, the OF40 Mark IIA, the OF40, and the Leopard 1A2. Now, Italy seems very similar to Germany on the surface because you do have 2 stabilized tanks and 2 unstabilized tanks, and of course both of them feature Leopards. However, I would say the Italian lineup is noticeably better because honestly, I just like the OF40s a lot more than I like things like the M48 Super or the M48 A2G A2. The OF40s just have generally better mobility across the board. They're a nice tank that you can use to flank with, get good positions with, and honestly, the armor isn't really noticeably different than it is for things like the M48 Super because neither of them are really going to survive the vast majority of shells that we've seen so far in this review. So on the whole, Italy does kind of just feel like Germany but better, and that's probably the only time you'll ever hear anybody make that statement. Well, okay, outside of food. France gets the AMX-32, the AMX-30B2 Brennus, the AMX-30B2, and the Char 25T, and immediately we have some very serious problems because the AMX-32 is the only vehicle in this group that is stabilized. And as we kind of mentioned before, that is a pretty serious issue when you're talking players of this skill that will generally know where you are at all times. On top of that, the AMX-32 is not very good. The shell is reasonably punchy, the armor can be okay, it doesn't carry ammo internally because you can have it all in the turret bustle, so it does have some decent-ish survivability, but the AMX-32 also has a pretty underpowered engine compared to the AMX-30s and the AMX-40s. On top of that, it really feels like they could have added the AMX-32 and the AMX-32-105, so you at least had 2 stabilized tanks before you had to start moving into the unstabilized ones. I really think lack of stabilizer is probably going to kill this whole lineup stone dead, if I'm being completely honest. China gets the ZTZ-88B, the ZTZ-88A, the CM-11, and the M60A3 TTS. Now, I actually just went over the ZTZ-88s in a video not too long ago looking at the best Chinese tanks. They are performing pretty well. It is a nice, well-rounded MET for its battle rating, so on the whole, I don't think it's a bad pick. The armor is trolly enough, especially given the average shell that most of these tanks are currently rocking, and it is a pretty decent tank in terms of mobility and its own firepower as well. On top of that, the CM-11 has an absurdly good gun for this battle rating, over 400mm of pen on its dart, and it can also get the reload all the way down to 5 seconds. That being said, it is using the old M60 engine, so the mobility is kind of terrible, but it can be an excellent sniper as it can rattle off rounds really efficiently and accurately, and the TTS isn't completely terrible either. On the whole, I think this is a pretty decent lineup and very well might see some pretty solid play. For Sweden, we have the Stridsvagn 105, the T55M, the Stridsvagn 104, and the T72M1. And right off the bat, there are some pretty serious problems with this lineup. The Stridsvagn 104 and 105 are almost completely dead in the water. Their mobility is exceedingly poor, and on top of that, they don't really have meaningful armor either. The guns are certainly usable, especially at this battle rating, and of course they also have stabilizers and darts, so you can easily snapshot snapshots to targets, but everybody else can snapshots at you and you're just not getting anywhere quickly. The T-72M1 might actually be one of the stronger tanks in any of the lineups we've seen so far. It's a pretty good tank in terms of its forward mobility, its firepower, and its armor. The problem is it's just not backed up by anything. The T-55M is not great. Like, again, much like the Stridsvagn 104s, you can kill things with it, but you're going to be at a disadvantage to a lot of the enemies you fight. And I think that's the biggest problem with this lineup, is once the T-72M1 gets destroyed, which obviously they are good players, they will kill you, what else do you spawn? Do you just spawn the T-55M and hope for the best? Do you spawn the 105 or 104 and just trundle your way up to the battle? I just don't see this lineup really working. And lastly, we have Israel with the Merkava Mark 1B, the Magok 7C, the Magok 6C, and the Magok 6B. And this right off the bat is striking me as probably one of the strongest and most well-rounded lineups we've seen so far. The Merkava Mark 1B is probably the best tank we have here. At very least, it's pretty close to it. It has pretty good mobility. The armor and internal layouts are pretty trolly. It has a punchy gun. There's very little you could want that it doesn't have. On top of that, the Magok 7C does one of the best things you can do for an M60 and upgrades the engine, on top of the fact that it does actually have pretty decent turret face and upper hull armor, at least for the types of shells that you will be fighting in a lot of instances. And the gun is quite punchy on the Magok 7C as well. Then you have the Magok 6C and 6B. For a third line, they're perfectly acceptable. There's not really anything to say about them that we haven't already said about some of the other M60s in this competition. Overall, I feel like Israel has some of the better entries that we've seen so far in terms of overall lineups for this competition. So overall thoughts, who are my favorites for lineups that will actually see serious play in this event? My initial thought is that Israel is probably going to be one of the more common ones. I also think both Japan and China have pretty solid all-round lineups that have the kind of attributes you are generally looking for. These three strike me as pretty good lineups in basically any situation. There's no situation where they will really let you down, even though they might not necessarily excel in all situations. Then you have some of the other lineups that at least have some interesting attributes. The biggest one is the British, because you do have the Chieftain Mark 10. It's a pretty good hull down tank. There are some maps like Kuban or Sinai that can both offer some pretty good positions for those to really do some work, so we very well might see some play in those areas. The American lineup also might see some play on maps like Kuban or Vietnam, because all of their tanks have stabilizers and good gun depression, so they can at least do some good work in those types of areas. And the XM803, as I mentioned, is a pretty strong vehicle in terms of being pretty well rounded. The Soviet lineup I was a lot more bully on before I saw the Israeli lineup, because honestly the Soviet lineup gets very heavily bodied by the Israeli lineup. The Merkava 1B and Magok 7C can click on the middle of anything in the Soviet lineup and will absolutely annihilate it. But the same is not necessarily true in the return fire. So I feel like in a lot of scenarios where you would take the Soviet lineup, you could just take the Israeli lineup and generally do better. I don't think it's bad, and it definitely might see some play on maps like Rhine, but I think that's about the best you'll really see out of it. The maps that have a lot more terrain, especially elevated terrain, this is an incredibly poor lineup for. Germany and Italy are kind of iffy. The biggest issue with both of these, you don't really have anything with any armor that can survive return fires, so the likelihood of you getting taken out is very high. On top of that, if you do get down to your third line tank, you're into unstabilized territory, which is pretty weak. Then you have the last two. France, I just don't see the AMX-32 being good enough to carry 3 unstabilized tanks, and the unstabilized tanks, while they're fine in a normal ground RB match, and in fact can actually be quite good in this kind of scenario when you're fighting the best players who all will generally know where you are at most, if not all of the time, I just don't think that lineup will work. And Sweden, the T-72M1 would be tempting to take just on its own, but there's just nothing to back it up. And even if you take the T-55M to have something with at least a little bit better mobility, if you ever get down to your third spawn, the Stridsvagn 105 and 104 are just kind of a throw. So I really don't see France or Sweden seeing any major play. Italy and Germany might see some. USA, UK seem like good candidates to see play on specific maps, but Israel, China, and Japan to me just seem like the most well-rounded lineups that you're more likely to see almost irrespective of the map. Lastly, we're going to take a look at the 4v4 Mixed Battles tournament taking place August 9th through 10th. And interestingly, this is 4v4 while previous Mixed Battles have been 5v5. I'm not really sure why they went for that change, but it's whatever. So we'll start off with USA. We have the T25, the M41A1, the Jumbo 76, the T20, the M36B2, the M19A1, and for air support we have the P63 and the SB2U. The big thing that stands out here is that there's basically no American heavy tanks despite existing at the battle ratings where you would reasonably expect to see the American heavy tanks. The closest you really have is the Jumbo 76, but as we're going to see, there are several vehicles that can still just click on the middle of that. So America is a little lacking in vehicles that have consistent armor, which is a little annoying. America does have two stabilized vehicles, and the M36B2 can basically handle anything. The T25 also has the goofy ability to reverse at full speed, which can sometimes take hits, although given the quality of these players, I doubt that's going to be that useful. The M41A1 is generally good. The CAS is not that good. The SB2U is a pretty weak CAS plane. The P63 though is a pretty solid all-around fighter. Overall, it's kind of an odd lineup. I'm not really sure why the decision was made to have basically none of the American heavies despite being at the battle rating where all of them are. Something like a T2065 would be pretty nice and not too terribly overpowered to round this lineup out, but that's just my thoughts. For Germany, we have the Panther F, the Tiger II-P, specifically the Porsche, the Tiger E, the Panzer 470, the Command Tiger Porsche, the Ostwind, and the ME410. Now, Tigers and Panthers get a bit of a poor reputation just because they so often get used by newer players, but they are very good vehicles. The Tigers in particular, especially the regular Tiger, not the Tiger II, are pretty well rounded, and the Tiger II-P, the Long 88, is still an excellent gun. On top of the fact that the Ostwind is actually a pretty decent backup tank hunter, and the Panzer 470, very low profile, very hard hitting gun. The CAS, the ME410, it's whatever. It's not really great, but it's not completely useless. On the whole, I do like this lineup better, at least for a normal battle in War Thunder. However, in a tournament where you have highly skilled players, the American turret traverse rates and the fact that Americans do have more stabilizers might actually make them a more appealing pick for more skilled players. For the Soviets, we have the T-44, the T-34-85, the IS-2, the KV-122, the 2S-1, the BTR-152D, the LA-7, and the PE-3 offering air support. This is a rather interesting lineup. I'm actually kind of surprised to see the T-44 come out because the T-44 is incredibly hard to deal with at these battle ratings, and if we can put the T-44 in the Soviet lineup, why can't the T-2065 go in the American lineup? That's a whole other thing. Anyway, the 2S1 is actually kind of an interesting pick because it's the only real derp gun we have in this whole competition. I'm not sure how useful that's necessarily going to be because it has no armor and a long reload, but we'll see how that pans out. The IS-2 and the KV-122 are generally decent performers, and the overall mobility and armor of the lineup is pretty sound, so I would expect to see this at least on urban maps like Rhine, although obviously as the normal Soviet disadvantages are still fully in play, it might experience some issues on maps like Kuban or Sinai. For Britain, we have the Centurion Mark I, the Conway, the Warrior, the AC-4, the Yestervark, the Crusader AA Mark II, and then for CAS, we have the Spitfire F Mark 14E and the Chesapeake Mark I. You probably heard me express some confusion during that, so for some reason, UK has not one but two AA vehicles, both the Crusader and the Yestervark, and also has the Warrior, which is an 8.0 IFV that has both an autocannon and a Milan anti-tank missile. Granted, the Warrior is not stabilized, and the rate of fire on the Raritan is pretty slow, and the Warrior itself is pretty weak. It's not like it has that much of an advantage over World War II vehicles, it just feels kind of anachronistic compared to the rest of the options, and the fact that UK gets two AAs is a little dopey, but it's whatever. Overall, I think the Centurion's a pretty good tank, the Conway's a pretty good tank, the AC Mark IV is actually surprisingly good, and the Yestervark is incredibly fast and can shred a lot of these vehicles from the side, so I think this might have some play, although this is still the era when the British reverse gears are usually capped at around 6 kilometers an hour, so even with the rest of their competition being mostly World War II era vehicles, that might be enough to keep these guys from seeing serious play. That being said, the Spitfire is an excellent anti-CAS plane if a team should need it. For Japan, we have the M47, the STA-3, the M41A1, the M36, and the Hori prototype with the Sub 1-2 as their anti-air, And for CAS, we have the N1K1 and the D4Y1. Now, this lineup really throws me off because this just strikes me as a lot of the stuff USA is trying to do, but better. If you want the M36, you have that, although this version doesn't have the heat rounds, but you do have the M47, which is an excellent tank all around. I actually love the M47. You have the STA3, you have the M41A1, basically the same as the American version. You have the Ho-Ri prototype, which is an absolute beast given all the other vehicles we've seen so far. Actually pretty close to impenetrable from the front and an incredibly powerful gun, and honestly, not bad mobility either. Japan seems incredibly strong on a wide array of maps. The M47 is really what throws me off because that is such a good tank compared to a lot of these other vehicles. Overall, I feel like Japan is actually pretty strong and very well rounded. For France, we have the AMX M4, the AMX 50 TOA 100, the AMX 13, the ARL 44, the M36 B2, the AMX 30 DCA 40, the TPK 641, and for CAS we have the Potez 631, not exactly a great CAS plane. So this lineup features not one, not two, but three separate French autoloaders, and the AMXs are really good. The 100mm can basically punch through the front of pretty much everything we've seen so far. These vehicles are incredibly mobile, they have an incredibly high rate of fire. On the whole, this lineup of autoloaders actually seems pretty solid, especially if you're looking for aggressive early plays. And the M36B2 means you can basically pin anything because it does have a heat FS round that will pin literally every vehicle we've seen up to this point from almost any angle. And then of course the AMX 30 DCA 40, actually not bad at shredding tanks either. The French lineup looks really aggressive, but very good at being aggressive, and might see play because of that, because as we've discussed in the past, these types and these caliber of players are really looking for vehicles that have good active advantages, features they can use to get into positions and dominate them very quickly in the map, and the French lineup certainly seems to offer a lot of that. Next up, we have Italy with the M26A1, the Sherman VC, the C13 T90, the M36B1, the Leopard 4070, and the BF109 and Breda 88 providing air support. Now this is kind of an interesting lineup because yet again we're seeing the M26A1, i.e. a tank very similar to one that the Americans could have, but the Americans don't have. The M26 does have a pretty underpowered engine, so that does hold it back a little, but I still think it would be nice to see the M26 in the American lineup, especially if the Italians can get it. The Sherman Firefly has a pretty punchy gun, although I'm not really sure how much you want that given that it's an unstabilized platform, and there are actually some pretty good tanks that can basically hit at least as hard, if not harder, and that have less limitations. The C1390 is pretty anemic, but it's not completely useless. The M36B1 in a very similar boat. The M36s are just generally a good chassis. The B1 isn't noticeably worse than any of the rest. The Leopard 4070 is exceedingly trolly. If you get a chance to use it, it can be good, although given the caliber of players, that might not happen. I think what really gives Italy the best chance of seeing play, though, is actually the BF109s. BF109s are very good CAS planes, not just because they can shut down enemy aircraft, but also because they do have enough bombs that if you are good at dropping them, even though they are small caliber, you can do a lot of damage. So it's possible that there's nothing really holding the Italian lineup back. It's decent-ish, although I do generally like the Japanese and French lineups better, but the Italian lineup does have probably the best CAS plane here, or at least that we've seen so far, so that might result in it seeing some play. For China, we have the Type 62, the M41D, the T3485, the IS-2, the SU-100, the Fengkong T-34, and then for CAS, we have the L11 and the V-12D. There's really not that much that stands out with this lineup. It's kind of similar to what you'd see from some other lineups. The IS-2 and the Su-100 have pretty punchy guns with decent-ish armor. The T-3485 doesn't really have that much armor with this battle rating, but combines a punchy gun with some mobility. The M41D is probably the funniest because it has a laser rangefinder and thermal imaging and a dart. Like, I'm pretty sure it's the only vehicle in this entire competition that has all of those features, and yet it's so bad that it probably won't see play regardless because the engine is incredibly underpowered and the dart is very weak and the gun is not stabilized. The Type 62, actually a pretty good tank. I've been having a lot of fun with it recently. I think it's pretty underrated. It has a good heat round, has a good APHE round. On the whole, I think this lineup is decent-ish, but it doesn't really have a lot that stands out to me as something that you would really want. But I could definitely see it showing up just because none of this is really bad. It's just none of it's really standing out. And last we have the Swedish lineup with the IKV91, the T3485, the Ush, not the good one, this is the anti-air, the Stridsvagn 103A, and the Lovkov 42. And then for air support, we have the J21RA and the B17B. So the Stridsvagn 103A is a very interesting inclusion because it has a 4-second reload, a laser rangefinder, and an APDS round. It actually is a reasonably powerful vehicle for this battle rating, mostly because a lot of the other vehicles here are around 6.3 to 6.7, and that's 8.0. The IKV91, actually a pretty decent vehicle given the types of enemies you're going to be fighting, and the Lovkov 42 for an anti-air actually can tank hunt pretty well. On top of that, the J21RA, pretty good actual cast plane. Even though this is the fighter variant, the guns can still do some work through the roof of a lot of the vehicles we've seen so far, and the B17B, not a bad bomber either in terms of its ability to deliver ordnance. Sweden is very weird, but I don't think it's specifically bad. That being said, I think the biggest issue here is you have nothing with any armor that could brawl in an urban map like Rhine. Sure, the Stridsvagn 103A has some armor, but also the armor is almost entirely concentrated to the front, and if you knock out the transmission, it can't turn the gun at all. The IKV91 has no armor whatsoever, the T3485 probably won't stand up that well to most of these guns, and of course the anti-airs aren't going to do much either. If you're in any kind of brawling capacity, this is not really a great lineup. However, if you do have hull down positions where you can really use the gun depression, especially on vehicles like the 103A where you have nice long range opportunities, this actually is a pretty decent lineup on a map like that. So before we go into overall thoughts, obviously Israel is not in the mix 4v4. I'm not really sure why. They do have some vehicles they could use this battle rating. I guess there just weren't enough of them to really fill out a true lineup, which I can certainly sympathize with. But looking at the overall lineups, the strongest to me immediately seems like actually Japan. The M47, the Hori prototype, you also have the M41A1 if you need to flank, and the M36 is just a nice punchy tank killer, on top of some decent-ish planes to at least provide support against enemy casts. Even if they don't have a great bomber, Japan just seems like a pretty good, well-rounded lineup if you don't specifically know what to pick. France also seems like a really good lineup that would work well in a lot of different situations, especially if you have players that want to be more aggressive and try to push the matter and take the fight to the enemy, which obviously a lot of these players do. While the Soviet, German, and Chinese lineups don't have a lot of superlatives in them that really stand out as being amazing like the Japanese and French lineups do, they are in general pretty solid all-rounders that do have some decent armor coupled with some pretty powerful guns that could make for a solid combination in the hands of a skilled player. Sweden seems like a very solid tech pick for maps like Sinai or Kuban, maps that have a lot of hills that you can use the Stridsvagn 103A and the IKV91 on. And if you are on those maps and you're looking for some good casts, Sweden actually has two pretty decent options there as well. I think as a niche tech pick, Sweden is pretty good, although I don't see it as a general pick that you would use on every map. On maps like Advance of the Rhine, it really doesn't seem like it has much gas to it. USA is in a bit of an awkward position because we're in a bit of the era of Lend-Lease, late World War II / early Cold War, where a lot of other countries are using their equipment, and this means that there aren't really a lot of unique vehicles that you can put in for USA, and the few that you could put in haven't been included. The 76 Jumbo is really the only thing the American lineup has going for it that's kind of unique, outside of, to a lesser extent, the T20. On the whole, I just don't see a ton of reasons to really use this lineup. I think the 76 Jumbo is still a perfectly fine pick, and the T25 can certainly have its moments, while the M41A1 is a good flanker and the M36B2 is a great sniper, but I really just don't feel like the lineup comes together in any meaningful way to offer a big advantage that you would get over another lineup like Japan. Italy is almost entirely glass cannons outside of the M26A1, which doesn't really give it a lot of staying power, so unless a team really wants the BF109G1 for CAS, which I could see, it's not completely outside of the realm of possibility, I just don't see a lot of great reasons why you would take this over any one of the other countries that have more going for them in the tank versus tank role. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know in the comments down below which of these lineups you think are some of the strongest. I always love to hear from you guys, and also let me know if you intend to tune in to any of these events, especially to grab the Twitch drops. The Twitch drops for these kind of tournaments are usually pretty solid. If you enjoyed the video, you found it entertaining, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.